أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. As we said, we want to keep on changing our pace between chapter 1 and chapter 2. That's the strategy I'm taking in explaining the book. Just so we don't get stuck in chapter 1 for the whole time, we're going to get a dose of chapter 2 now, which is on refraining from acts of disobedience. And then we're going to come back to chapter 1. In chapter 1, the main things that are still left to talk about is etiquettes with salah, etiquettes with fasting. And he gives us very, very beautiful gems on certain pages in the end of chapter 1. I'll share those with you. I'll tell you where to open up. But for now, in this session, from now until Asr, we're going to be going over Al-Qism Al-Thani, Al-Qawlu fi Ijtinab Al-Ma'asi, on refraining from acts of disobedience. In this section, brothers and sisters, he takes a very interesting approach to explaining to us the impact of sins on the body and soul by going over each limb and the sins that relate to it. In the very beginning of the section, if you look at it, he says, know that the entire religion is made up of two parts. One of them is refraining from acts of disobedience, and the other is the performance of acts of obedience. All right? The first part is more important and more serious. ترك المعاصي, ترك المناهي, هو الأشد, as he says here. Abandoning sin is the more severe side, even though both of them are critical and essential. Doing acts of worship and abandoning sins. In fact, doing the acts of worship is part of abandoning the sins, right? Because one of the biggest sins, what is one of the most major sins that you could possibly do in Islam that is a physical act of worship? Physical act of worship. Shirk is not a physical act of worship. Someone said something about prayer. Abandoning prayers. The only act of worship that there's a difference of opinion among the scholars about the one who abandons it is salah. You know, so you don't do salah, it's actually one of the biggest sins you could possibly commit in Islam altogether. Someone who doesn't pray is cut off from Allah wal-'iyadhu billah. That's why there's some severe hadiths that tell us العهد الذي بيننا وبينهم الصلاة فمن تركها فقد كفر. Right? That which is between us and them is salah. Whoever abandons it has disbelieved. Right? So there's a difference of opinion among the scholars about the one who abandons salah. Is he or she still Muslim or not? Difference of opinion. Majority say that they're still Muslim, but they're committing one of the most major sins in Islam altogether. But anyway, so فعل الطاعات is من ترك المعاصي. Right? Doing the acts of worship is part of abandoning sin. Anyway, so the first section here is titled, The Sins Committed with the Limbs. And he says, know that you disobey Allah Most High with your limbs, while they are a bounty from Allah and a trust to you. So you're using the bounties of Allah Most High to disobey Him is the ultimate ingratitude. Right? What does he say? He's saying, فاستعانتك بنعمة الله تعالى على معصيته غاية الكفران. What is kufran? What does that mean? That's ingratitude. For me to use the eyes that Allah gave me to disobey Him, it means that I do not recognize Him as the giver. To use the hands that He's given me, the tongue He's given me, to disobey Him, it shows that I'm not recognizing Him as the source of my blessings. Right? So that's why they say that the essence of taqwa is أَلَّا تَتَقَوَّى عَلَى الْمَعْصِيَةِ بِجَوَارِحِكَ. That you don't find the strength to do the sins in disobeying Allah على معصية الله with بنعمه. أَلَّا تَتَقَوَّى على معصية الله تعالى بنعمه. Don't disobey Allah with His blessings upon you. Right? So he says here, after that, indeed the parts of your body are your subjects. So pay attention to how you govern them. Each of you is a shepherd, and each of you is answerable for his flock. كلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته. Another way to understand this hadith is what? أنا مسؤول عن لساني. I'm responsible for my tongue. I'm responsible for my hands. I'm responsible for my eyes. I'm responsible for my ears. All of this. وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ جَمِيعَ أَعْضَائِكَ سَتَشْهَدُ عَلَيْكَ في عرصات القيامة بلسان ذلق يفضحك الله تعالى على ملأ من الخلائق. What does he say here? Your limbs are going to be able to eloquently and clearly articulate on the day of judgment, right? So this tongue I have is going to be able to communicate without my control. It's going to witness against me. What did I say with my tongue? What did I do? All of this, يوم تشهد عليهم ألسنتهم وأيديهم وأرجلهم بما كانوا يعملون. Right? I can imagine this ability to communicate for my tongue. I can't imagine it for any other my other limbs. I can't imagine it. I can't perceive it. You know what? We need a fantasy movie or a sci-fi movie to get us to think about that. Right? Sci-fi movies, with that imagination that they have there, the animations and the cartoons, they think of such crazy, bizarre things to happen. What if that could happen in a movie? Or if they could project that in a movie, why can't I ever think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can enable that to become real life? Right? Allah Azza wa Jal can make anything communicate He desires. So it's so profound that on the Day of Judgment, there's going to be a way for the limbs to witness against the person. Right? So let's see, he says in another verse, اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون. He says, today we'll seal their mouths and their hands will speak to us and their feet will testify as to what they have earned. And then he goes on to list in this section what the limbs or how the limbs will potentially witness against the person. He says, as for the eye, it was created for you only, so that you might be guided by it in the darkness, that you might be helped by it with respect to your needs, that by it you might see the wonders and the dominions of the heavens and the earth and consider the signs they contain. Right? Now, if you think about that, how much money do you think it would take to replicate the creation of the eye with the magnificence that it has? They will spend millions and millions and billions to try to reproduce this one thing that people have, and they won't be able to produce like what Allah produced. Brothers and sisters, it's something I should take into account. When I think of my eyes, look, this so soft, tender part of my body that Allah Azza wa Jal has given so much profound greatness. I should be thinking about how the function of this eye. How would my life look like if I didn't have this eye? Let me ask myself that question. As he just said, the darkness I'll be in. If you know someone who sees with their heart, what does that mean? In Arabic, we refer to this person as someone who's basir, right? We don't want to call them blind. We want to call them basir. They see with their eyes, their hearts, right? If you know someone who's blind, they can't see with their physical eye, you know how difficult living is, how lonely living is for someone in that reality. These eyes that I have, if I can't see for a second, it's such a terrifying experience. Imagine that some people will experience the Day of Judgment blind. Imagine, like all the sheer terror of the Day of Judgment, the screaming, the yelling, the sounds, the noise, and I have no idea where I'm going, and I'm just like moving about, falling, stumbling left and right. For some people, the Quran says that they will cross the bridge over hellfire blind. That's a scary experience. You can't even imagine that type of experience. For someone, when I could see danger coming, I could at least prepare myself for it and try to get out of its way. When it's coming my way and I can't even see it, just think of that. Think about the blessings that the eye is used for. And then he says, so protect your eye from 4 things. From looking at the opposite gender in a way that is illicit and haram. And using this eye to trigger shahwa and desire in a way that Allah Azza wa Jal hasn't meant it to be triggered. Right? Number 2, he says, from looking at a beautiful form in a lustful way, from looking at a Muslim with an eye of disdain, right? Disdain. Look at it. So that's one side of this, right? Ghadd al-basar, not using it to trigger shahwa in illicit ways, and all the destruction that the entertainment industry and the all the destruction that the entertainment industry and pornography has caused to people in terms of their mental health. You could speak about that endlessly. Just think about it. You know, one of the questions I got during the break was about narcissism, and is someone held accountable for being a narcissist? And you know, the answer to this is sometimes the actions and decisions that we take, the lifestyle we choose to live, leads to certain mental health realities that break us. I've made those decisions that led me to that doorstep. So I should be cognizant of this, and I should think about this deeply. You know, the way that the eyes have been used have destroyed many lives, right? And when I think about that and I add to the equation how sometimes it could, a look of ihtiqar and disdain, I'm looking down on others, right? Sometimes I could hide that feeling and that emotion inside me, right? I'm seeing someone and they can't see the thought that's in my, like we said in the beginning of this, imagine if sins had a scent, no one would stand to be in our presence. Imagine if people could hear the thoughts that are going on in our mind, no one would want to be our friends anymore, right? No one would want to be with us, right? So I'm looking at someone with this look of disdain. I'm better than this person. I'm great. This person is not. I'm high. This person's low. I'm able. This person is incapable, right? I'm better than them. I'm better than her, right? This look of disdain is full of sinfulness. These are ways and examples. Or let's not look at disdain. He gives us a last example, number 4. From being on the lookout for another Muslim's faults, right? I'm entering a Muslim's home and I'm allowing my eye to wander, search for things that I shouldn't be searching for. I'm trying to look at this person's flaws and see what they don't want me to see, right? Things that I'm trying to conceal. It's unimaginable sometimes how people would operate, you know, to those who are actually even trying to be kind to them. It's unimaginable. Like imagine that, you know, that intihak, breaching the trust of another person's private space. People do it sometimes to each other. Like they'll visit someone and look for something that'll expose something about this person that they don't want anyone to do and know about. Their medication that's hidden in their bathroom cabinets, mathalan, or the filth that that's concealed in the corners of their home, just so that they could go talk about this person. Right? This person's a dirty person. Oh, this person's X, Y, or Z. People say things with their tongue. They see with their eyes and they talk with their tongue things that will destroy them before Allah Azza wa Jal. You know, again, you could think of countless examples of this. So he gives you here being on the lookout for another Muslim's faults. Right? Now, of course, this is not meant to say that I shouldn't be critical, especially when it's about the public good. Right? When it's a person's personal, private life, that's one thing. But when it's about the rights of the Muslims, no, then I could approach with scrutiny. Like if someone is in a position of public service, and they're doing something for the bounty of the general Muslim community or for a state, right? Imagine someone comes up and say, it's not allowed to speak about said Muslim leader who's, you know, punishing people left and right and throwing people in prisons. It's backbiting, right? Imagine that. And Allahu Akbar, the person could like literally ruin the lives of millions of people, and you're worried about me speaking ill of him? Is that what it is? No, it's different. It's different, right? So it depends on what you're being critical about. If it's about something personal, private, that really doesn't relate to anyone else, taqillah. Why ruin your akhirah for nonsense of dunya? That's why the Quran says it. لا خير في كثير من نجواهم. There's no goodness in much of their private conversations. Much of their private conversations on the Day of Judgment will be a source of great regret for them on the Day of Judgment. What does he go on to say on page 92? As for the ear, protect it from listening to reprehensible innovations, backbiting. There are sins you could commit with the eye. There are even more sins you could think of with committing with your ear. Look at this. He says, listening to backbiting, lewd talk, delving into falsehood, or talking about the faults of others. Right? Why is that? Isn't that with the tongue? Isn't that with the tongue? Don't you talk about the flaws of others with your tongue? Why does that relate to the sins of the ear? Who can tell me why? Who can tell me why? Talking about the flaws and faults of others. How could that possibly relate to the sins committed with the ear? You guys with me? You guys with me, or is the shawarma settling in? Is the shawarma settling in? All right. How does it relate to the ear? Not to your own self. Well, that would be okay. You're listening to someone else do it, right? When you're in a gathering in which someone is being defamed and their reputation is being defiled, right? There's someone doing it and then there's someone listening to it. What does Imam Ghazali tell you here? وَلَا تَظُنَّنَّ أَنَّ الْإِثْمَ يَخْتَصُ بِهِ الْقَائِلْ دُونَ الْمُسْتَمِعِ. Right? Don't think for a second that the sin will only be for the one speaking it, not the one listening to it. No. You think that if you're in a gathering in which awful things are being said, wrongful things that are displeasing to Allah, the one saying it's the only one that is going to get the sin? No. The Prophet ﷺ says, what does he say? إِنَّ الْمُسْتَمِعَ الشَّرِيكُ الْقَائِلِ وَهُوَ أَحَدُ الْمُغْتَابِينَ. The one listening is the person speaking's partner in sin. That's what he's that's what he is to him. So that's a sin that actually relates to the ear as well. So many things that you can think about, the sins that relate to the ear, right? And then he goes on to say, as for the tongue, again, still page 92, at the very bottom of the page, it was created for you only so that you could spend much time in the remembrance of Allah Most High and in recitation of His book, and you could guide Allah's creatures to His way, and that you express your needs in worldly and religious matters. Right? Look at this. The tongue. Now, this is a gradual buildup, actually. All right, you could think of sins with your eyes, right? More sins even with your ears, and even more than all that with your tongue. You know what they say? The tongue is actually the playing field of the shaitan. The tongue is the playing field of the shaitan. Imam Ghazali, he beautifully and eloquently describes, he has this chapter in Ihya Ulumuddin, the revival of the teachings of the faith. He says, what does he say? أما بعد فإن اللسان من لطائف صنع الله العجيبة. Right? He says that the tongue is one of Allah's miraculous creations. And then he goes on to say after that, فإنه صغير جرمه كبير طاعته وجرمه. What does he say about the lisan? He says it is very small in size, but the acts of worship and the acts of sinfulness linked with the tongue are so massive and destructive. Right? So he goes on to list over 24 flaws pertaining to speech in the Ihya. Right? We could make a series about the flaws of the tongue. Series, just go ahead. It could be a several-month lecture series, all about the flaws pertaining to speech. Right? And he says, وَأَمَّا اللِّسَانِ. All right, he says the tongue was created for you to remember Allah. So be very careful of what you allow to be allowed on your tongue. Right? So then what does he say after that? He says, after that, protect your tongue from 8 things. He says, protect your tongue from 8 things. The first of these is lying. The first sin relating to speech is lying. By the way, this is actually one of the worst sins altogether. Is that right? It's actually one of the kaba'ir. أَلَا لَعْنَةُ اللَّهِ عَلَى الْكَاذِبِينَ. Indeed, Allah's damnation is upon the liars. Not all lying is the same. What's the worst type of lying? What's the worst type of lying? When someone lies about Allah and lies about the Prophet or lies about deen. That's the worst type of lie. Worst type of lie altogether. But still, the Prophet ﷺ, he says about lying, there is no way that lying and faith could ever coexist in one vessel. No way. If there's lying, then faith, iman is almost non-existent. We're not going to say they're not Muslim. They're still Muslim. But it's almost non-existent when someone is a liar. Lying, the Prophet ﷺ was asked, هل المؤمن يخاف? Is a believer someone who could be afraid? Yeah. The mu'min could be afraid. Right? هل المؤمن جبان? Can the mu'min believer be a coward? Yes, the believer could be a coward. هل يكذب? Prophet ﷺ said no. The believer doesn't lie. Right? And then, so that's the first sin that he mentions here. The next one is breaking a promise. Al-khulfu fil wa'd. These are things, by the way, that we all need to be very, very aware. You know, these things, if they're lost, by the way, a person's integrity is gone. You need to be very careful of this, breaking a promise. Beware of ever promising something and not keeping your promise. Rather, let your goodness toward people in the realm of action without the need for words. But if you are forced to make a promise, then be careful not to break it unless you are incapable of fulfilling it. What does that mean? Be very mindful when you give people a promise. Because if you give people a promise, now you're bound by this promise. Bound how? Legally bound by it? No. They say, the scholars actually address this. هل الوعد ملزم أم لا? Is wa'd, is a promise something that is binding or not? What do you think the answer is? Is a promise binding or not? What do you think? Raise your hand if you say yes. Raise your hand if you say yes. Raise your hand if you say no. Why do you say no? Huh? There's no written document. All right, you're onto it. They say, al-wa'du mulzimun diyanatan la qada'an. Right? All right, so imagine you say, hey, brother, man, if you just help me out in this situation, I promise you, I'm going to compensate you and I'm going to compensate you well. I'm going to give you X amount of money, inshallah, and don't worry, you could trust me, I promise. I will come through. And then you help this person out and you think that they're going to compensate you. And guess what? They say, I'm sorry, times are a little bit tough and, there's nothing to bind me. Now, what are you going to say about this person's character? This person is of a lowly character. This person is a lousy person. He's a lousy human being. A lousy excuse for a human being who says things with his tongue and doesn't follow through with the promises he makes to people. He's a lousy person. But is there something to bind this person legally speaking? No. According to most scholars, the only scholars that disagree with this is the Maliki school. They say, al-wa'du mulzimun diyanatan wa qada'an. And of course, in a certain context. If someone promises someone in the context of transactions something, then, and there's proof to prove this promise, it is as binding as a contract, according to the Maliki school. According to the others, the majority, they say no. It is morally binding, but not legally binding. What does that mean? They will get sins for breaking their promise, but in a court of law, go ahead. You want to get away with it in this dunya? Get away with it. You're going to face it on the day of judgment, right? Why did you make this promise, right? So, al-kadhib, and then he says, al-khulfu fil wa'd, one of the worst sins that are relating to the tongue. And then he says, after that, all right, look on the top of page 96, the Prophet ﷺ said, there are three qualities which, if they lie hidden within a person, render him a munafiq. Even if he fasts and he prays, right? ثلاث من كن فيه فهو منافق وإن صام وصلى. May Allah rid our hearts of these things, brothers and sisters. When he speaks, he lies. When he makes a promise, he breaks it. And when he is given a trust, he betrays it. وَإِذَا تُمِنَ خَانَ. اللهم برئ قلوبنا من النفاق. These are easy things to fall into, by the way, brothers and sisters. They are easy things to fall into. May Allah protect us from them. And when he's given a trust, he betrays this trust, right? And then we find the third thing that he tells us is about ghiba, backbiting. Restrain your tongue from backbiting. For backbiting is a sin more severe for a Muslim and then he mentions a narration. This narration, he says, then is a sin more severe for a person than acts of adultery. Now, of course, what's the explanation behind that? We need to go back to the books because, of course, we know that from the kaba'ir, mubiqat, one of the grave sins is is zina, fornication. So how could ghiba be at that level? We'd need to go back to the words of our scholars to explain to us. All right, so here he says, وَمَعْنَى الْغِيبَةِ أَن تَذْكُرَ إِنسَانًا بِمَا يَكْرَهُهُ لَوْ سَمِعَهُ. What is ghiba? What is backbiting? It is for you to speak about someone in a manner they would dislike. Whether it's true or not, right? Many people have this misconception. If I say something bad about somebody that's really in him, then I'm not lying. They're really like this, right? That's ghiba. If it's not in them, then we call it something else. We call it buhtan. That's slander. Slander, all right. But it's still ghiba if it's in them. Now, of course, situations warranting. Sometimes you need to discuss something ill of somebody for the sake of resolving a conflict or for the sake of seeking advice. Now, of course, we should not understand these things as absolutes because sometimes we need to speak about something that is not so pleasant in order for us to figure it out, right? So that's I would temper that with this understanding. Wallahu a'lam. All right, and then he gives us a lot of details about there's so ghiba. By the way, he mentions this. One of the things. Look, one of the things in our deen that we learn is that these sins have a consequence. Sometimes this consequence is in this dunya and sometimes it's in the akhirah. You with me? Sometimes these sins have a consequence in this dunya and sometimes they have a consequence in the akhirah. The sins I do with the tongue or the eyes or the ears. One example of backbiting is the Prophet ﷺ tells us, whoever abandons his brother or doesn't fend for the honor of his brother in a situation where his integrity is being wrongfully breached, then Allah Azza wa Jal will abandon this person in a situation where they hope to find someone to defend their honor and integrity. Right? Again, this is part of the consequences of sins. These are the sins relating to the limbs, brothers and sisters. That's an example. Another sin, number 4. Look at number 4. Going ahead a little bit. This is on page 98. Some of the sins relating to the tongue are al-mira'u wal-jidalu wa munaqashatu an-nasi fil kalam. So then what does he say? Disputation, argumentation, and competitive debate with people. That's what he says. Now, there's a beautiful hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says, this takes a lot of strength, a lot of spiritual strength and emotional strength. It's not easy to do this. Wallahi, it's not easy to do this. That's why, again, we're all students before this stuff. This is not information I'm learning. These are spiritual concepts I'm experiencing and being exposed to. There's a lot of work we all need to do with this stuff. May Allah better us. May Allah forgive us. Disputation. Look, أنا زعيم ببيت في ربض الجنة لمن ترك المراء وإن كان محقا. Prophet ﷺ, he says, I promise a house in paradise in the prime real estate of Jannah, in the best parts of Jannah for someone who abandons arguing even when they're in the right. It is a difficult thing to do. Wallahi, it's so difficult. It's so taxing on the nafs. Especially when you know you're right and you feel you're right and you know the other person's wrong. There's something that, it's very difficult for the ego to just swallow that. Well, it's very, very difficult for the ego to swallow that. So look at this. He goes on to say, argumentation actually, there's a hadith that tells us that if Allah Azza wa Jal, إِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ بِقَوْمٍ فِتْنَةً, if Allah wants fitna for a people, you know what happens to them? Right? رَفَعَ عَنْهُمْ الْعَمَلِ or جَعَلَ بَيْنَهُمُ الْجَدَلِ وَرَفَعَ عَنْهُمُ الْعَمَلِ أو ما في معناه. The Prophet ﷺ says that if Allah wants to expose people to fitna and failure, spiritual failure, then He will make between them useless argumentation and He will raise from between them productive action. That is ما ضل قوم بعد هدى كانوا عليه إلا أوتوا الجدل ورفع عنهم العمل. It's another variation of the hadith. Right? Another variation of the hadith is when, you know what's a sign of misguidance? When people are enamored with arguing. or they're given this capacity just not incessantly argue, back and forth. And you find them so unproductive or non-productive, or I don't know what's it, unproductive, I think. So unproductive, they were not doing anything. They're just staying where they're at, non-stop arguing. That's a sign that they have lost their way. If they're not doing productive things and they're arguing all the time, it is a sign that they have lost their way. I know it's time for Asr, and inshallah in a few minutes we'll stop. 5 minutes and we'll pray Salat al-Asr inshallah. 5 minutes and we'll stop for Asr. The fifth sin that he attributes to the tongue is ascribing goodness to oneself, right? فَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنِ اتَّقَى. Right? Do not ascribe goodness to yourselves. He is more knowing of the one who is God-fearing. Now look at this, page 100, by the way. One of the hukama was asked, what is something true yet vile? What is مَا الْقَبِيحِ? What is something true yet vile? What does vile mean? It means qabih, something wicked. He answered, ثَنَاءُ الْمَرْءِ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ. The person praising himself. Now, someone might praise themselves and it's totally untrue. They're like, they think that they're so great, yet they're so horrible. That's possible. But sometimes what may happen is them praising themselves, and they're right. Yeah, they do a lot of good things. Yes, they do help a lot of people. But it's so ugly for them to say it. May Allah forgive us. May Allah not make us a people who mention their favors, who remind others of their favors, who see their goodness and their service of others. May Allah not make us like this at all. Allahumma ameen. So that's the fifth sin, he says. Cursing, al-la'n. Cursing is another one of the sins. 3 minutes. Jazakallah khair. So he says, the sixth sin, فَإِيَّاكَ أَن تَلْعَنَ شَيْئًا مِمَّا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى مِنْ حَيَوَانٍ أَوْ طَعَامٍ أَوْ إِنسَانٍ بِعَيْنِهِ. Don't be a person who curses. Don't be a person who curses at anything or anyone or any issue. Don't do that. Remove your tongue from that filth. All of that, one of the things, brothers and sisters, about the realities of dunya and akhirah. Take a look at this. You're with me? You're with me? In this dunya, there are sources of light that can't be seen with the eye. They're seen in alam al-ghayb. And there are sources of darkness that can't be perceived with the eye. But they're there in alam al-ghayb. When we transition to the akhirah and we become members of the unseen realm, right, after we leave this dunya, we become exposed to the unseen realities. Look at what it says on the Day of Judgment. What does it say? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَوْمَ تَبْيَضُّ وُجُوهٌ وَتَسْوَدُّ وُجُوهٌ. The day that certain faces will be radiant with light and other faces will be darkened with the darkness of sin. By the way, this light isn't because of a person's light complexion. Abadan, abadan. On that day, there's only one source of light. Amal salih. Amal salih. Righteous deeds. It is so interesting that the hidden light will become exposed on that day. That's why on the Day of Judgment, one of the marks of the believers, what does the Quran say? سِيمَاهُمْ فِي وُجُوهِهِمْ مِنْ أَثَرِ السُّجُودِ. Their sima, or their mark, or their symbol, is in their face from the effects of prostration. This nur, is it in the dunya or in the akhirah? What do you think? What do you think? This light and this sima, this special radiance, is in this life or the akhirah? What do you think? Huh? Both? I agree. Both. There is a special light in this dunya that people with a discerning spiritual eye can see in spiritual people, right? But it is subtle. Not everyone could see that light. On the Day of Judgment, it's going to be obvious, right? For everybody to see it. The effects of nur will be in the face and in the arms and in the feet, right? From the effects of those acts of worship, it will become light. And the darkness that's hidden, right? This is not a darkness that you can make hide by lights or by cosmetics or that stuff. No. No cosmetic on the face of the earth is going to be able to hide the darkness of sin in a person whose heart is cut off from Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? These are realities of the dunya and the akhirah, and that's something interesting to think about. So this tongue, when it's used for haram, guess what? It's going to be a source of immense darkness on the Day of Judgment for the person who used it for haram. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not make our limbs dark on the Day of Judgment because of the sins that we committed in our dunya. This is a good place to stop. Of course, like I said, there's like tons of content in the book, but we're getting doses. We're getting doses, and continue reading it on your own. And maybe perhaps at a later date, we could go through all the gaps that are left that we didn't get to cover in our session today. But inshallah, we're going to take a break right now, and we're going to pray Salat al-Asr, and we'll continue with the next session after Salah.